When my grandfather was in ministry with the Salvation Army in China, he would often send me photos back, photos of families and the people that he served in rural villages in China. And despite living in a broken society where food was scarce and the government had no concerns for its people, children were freely playing, women were laughing and chatting, and men were engaging over cups of tea. I remember his stories were so vivid that they captured expressions of dignity and portrayed stories of hope. These stories, however, were also infused with issues that my young mind could never comprehend. Oppression, imprisonment, and affliction were so foreign to my carefree childhood. But I was fascinated with these images because they offered a glimpse into the intimate lives of the poor. They were filled with stories, and stories of overcoming hardship and persevering with dignity. And I began to see that these stories were reflections of hope, even in the midst of brokenness. In a world where beauty is often synonymous with perfection, voices from overlooked communities often go unheard. Stories of sexual abuse, domestic violence, rape, incest, starvation, poverty are far too prevalent, and it often tempts us to deafen our ears with ignorance rather than to listen with compassion. And perhaps many of us choose not to listen, afraid to identify with a broken reality in attempts to conceal the brokenness in our own lives. When I was 11, I received a photograph from my grandfather of a little girl from a poor village in rural China. And she was around the same age as I was. She's that girl in the middle. She was shy, timid, and quiet-looking with an unforgettable, sad gaze. And in China, girls are essentially involuntarily born into oppression with strict rules on the number of children that families can have. Little boys are often favored above little girls to bring dignity to the family, and little girls are often shamefully labeled as unworthy of life. And their voices are often silenced by the cultural pressures to reach perfection that dominate their ability to dream. And because of the cultural pressures that often silence girls in China, it seemed that her confidence was broken and that she hadn't yet realized her worth. And this was the context of her story. And when my grandfather sent me this photo when I was 11 years old, he titled the photo, "She Reminds Me of You." And it wasn't until now, 12 years later, that I'm faced with the haunting realization that that little girl could have been me. I didn't grow up in extreme poverty. I didn't grow up in rural China. But in some sense, I was like her. I identified with her brokenness, feeling as if my voice was also silenced by the self-afflicted lies of unworthiness that crept into my spirit. In my teen years, I was that kid, that seemingly shy, timid, and quiet little girl on the outside, but in reality, on the inside, I was boiling with an attitude. That kid in the middle, that cute little girl, that's my sister. Homegirl on the left, that's me. Apparently, I intimidated all of my youth workers. I would avoid eye contact by rolling my eyes. When people said, "Hey, Nikole, how you doing?" I would turn around and walk the other direction. I desperately tried to conceal my insecurities with a facade that said, "I hate you, don't talk to me." Nothing in particular ever happened to me. My parents were great. I grew up in a wonderful family, middle-class family, whatever. But I couldn't escape from myself, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never reveal the ways in which I felt broken. And so growing up as a little girl in church, I felt that there were cultural implications to reach success, to achieve perfection, and to conceal the realities of my inner pain. I felt that I had to mask my fears and to never reveal this brokenness that was inside of me, because that would be considered undignified. I couldn't embody the dignity exhibited in those around me, and so I hid behind this facade. I was afraid to come to terms with my own pain, but this facade was secretively crying out for someone to stop and to listen to my story. When I was 14, my mom became very ill, and she had blacked out when she was out of town. And I remember she went to the hospital when she was out of town in Seattle, and she came home. And while she came home, we were waiting for the results to come back. And I remember that day that she got the results back, her and my father were in the bedroom, and I can just hear them sobbing uncontrollably. And I knew that she was diagnosed with cancer. I was 14 at the time. And I remember for the first time ever, I went to my room and I cried out to God and I asked God, God, where are you? And I remember that in my moment of brokenness, I felt a sense of comfort that responded in saying, because I loved you first, learn to love yourself and to love others. And so, since then, I've been on this journey of learning what that looks like. And through our family's trials, God was challenging me to recognize my pain and turn it into something of worth. And he began to reveal this purpose in our hardships so that I could learn to love more fully and to recognize the dignity in myself and the dignity in others. And during my mother's treatment, I saw her in agonizing pain where her ability to be gracious wasn't always at the forefront, but yet her season of brokenness revealed the sense of authenticity in her humanity. I watched her progress as she conquered through this painful season with a transformed spirit filled with a courageous dignity. She helped me understand that beautiful lives are perfected through seemingly broken situations. And through her story, I was learning to love myself despite my angry heart that held on to everything but beautiful. Since then, I've been on this journey of learning how to unveil these voices of dignity and learning to share these stories that empower, restore, and transform. And so I use photography and film as a means to platform these stories of people who are living in situations of poverty and oppression and brokenness. And this has given me an opportunity to peer deeper into the human spirit. And I've learned from their innermost struggles. Through darkness and despair, I've seen their joy as they conquer their hardships. I've learned to identify in their situations of brokenness by not dwelling on the imperfections of my own life, but recognizing that dignity is an inherent gift from God. And so in coming to terms with brokenness in my own life, I've been learning to better identify with the youth that I serve. And so whether I'm teaching a photography workshop with my foster kids in Compton, or I'm advocating for secure college education for my girls in Eastern Africa, I've learned that brokenness is not something to be concealed, but unveiled as a thing of beauty. A couple years ago, I was in Zambia shooting a friend's wedding, and I met the whole family, and I met this girl named Jean, and she was the niece of the groom. And Jean really stuck out to me because she was always the one that was kind of off to the side, extremely quiet, very shy. But every time I tried to talk to her, she would just roll her neck at me. She would roll her eyes at me, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was like that when I was 14 years old too. So I really identified with her, and I was like, I'm gonna be her friend. So, we would just hang out together, and one day we were out having dinner at a friend's house, and we were walking back to where we were staying, and she was walking with me, and she leaned on me, and she held my hand, and she said, Nikole, my stomach really hurts. I said, well, was it something you ate? She's like, no, it hurts like this pretty much every day. It feels like there's a dagger being stabbed in my stomach. And I said, well, have you gone to the clinic to get it checked out? She's like, no, I don't want to go to the clinic. I don't want anyone to know. And so I stopped, and I asked her. I said, well, really, what's going on? She looked at me, and she said, okay, I'll tell you my story, but I hope you understand. She said last year, she was 13 years old, she was walking home from school one day, a normal day, and 3 men approached her, and they all had knives, and they said, if you don't come with us, we're going to kill you. And so she thought that she had no other choice but to go with them, and so she followed them, they dragged her into the bush, and 1 man raped her. They attempted to gang rape her, but somehow she found a piece of metal on the floor and hit them off with it, and she fled. She said the experience after that was so traumatizing that she couldn't focus in school. Her grades, she went from an A student to a failing student. Every time she would see a male come anywhere close to her, she would completely feel this rage and bitterness just build up inside of her. She was carrying this burden, and she couldn't give it to anybody because no one would listen. She couldn't tell her family what had happened. She couldn't tell her church because of the stigma of rape associated in Africa. She couldn't tell anyone. And so it came to a point where she was so completely overwhelmed by the circumstance that had happened to her that she started to blame herself. And these lies of unworthiness began to creep into her spirit. And she couldn't take it any longer, and so she decided to take her life. Her sister had come back from the hospital just the day before, and so she took all the medication that her sister brought home from the hospital and overdosed on it. And when that didn't have a quick enough effect, she went to the kitchen and she took a knife to her wrist. And I think because I identified with her so much and I saw so much of myself in her, that night I just went to the bathroom and I cried. And again I asked God, I said, God, where are you? Where are you in the midst of these girls who are forgotten, these girls who are overlooked, these girls who have no one to turn to? God, you who are all gracious and merciful and kind, where are you in the midst of this? And in that moment of brokenness, I heard God respond in saying, Nikole, where are you? Where is your mercy for the poor? Where is your grace for those who are exploited? Where is your listening ear to girls who are overlooked in your community? Where are you? In some ways, I can identify with Jean. I identify with her thoughts of inadequacy and loss of self-worth. I identify with her dreams to achieve greatness and her aspirations to help others and her desires to be made whole. I identify with her feelings of feeling bombarded with situations that seem to overwhelm, but still filled with a hope to persevere and to be victorious. I identify with her fears of voicing her story, but somehow finding that courage to unveil her brokenness as a thing of beauty. And so in learning to listen to the stories of the incredible people like my grandfather, my mom, and in teens like Jean, I realized that I am then liberated to embrace my inherent worth as well. I'm challenged to recognize that there is beauty in seemingly broken situations. And I think that many church communities may unknowingly place an emphasis on becoming more attractive by perfecting their identity. But the pursuit of success may cause us to walk over the people who are overlooked, the people who are in poverty, the people who are in oppression. And so by intentionally listening to the stories around us, we're given opportunities to develop relationships as an invitation to acceptance rather than judgment. And so as I see myself in the eyes of the little girl in China, and I see myself in the attitude of Jean, in some strange way, I think that learning to identify with the brokenness of others help us repair our own sense of brokenness. And so as youth leaders, we need to recognize that we need to recognize the brokenness in our own lives to better identify with the stories of the youth that we serve. And in doing so, we are affirming their sense of worth and transforming brokenness into something of beauty. And so in January, Jean will be starting her first year of college at a really renowned school in Zambia. And she wants to study journalism because she wants to speak on behalf of other girls in her community. And so she told me later on, she showed me the scar on her wrist, and she told me, you know what stopped me from cutting myself even deeper? She said, when I saw the blood, I realized that that was the blood of Christ. And because he first loved me, I need to then learn to love myself and to love others. May we also learn to love each other better by identifying with stories of our youth, by embracing the dignity innate within our being, even in the midst of brokenness.